Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Oh. Hey, everybody, we're going to get started in about 4 minutes. Not 4 minutes, 7 minutes. And we are going to talk about what we didn't talk about last week, the Combahee River Collective, mashed up with the 1619 project. And we'll see what happens when we integrate these two really, really powerful texts. So stay tuned. We'll be dropping them in the LinkedIn chat for everybody. And our Metaverse house is under construction. So that's why you see it in the background, but you get to see fresh face today. So go ahead and grab a cup of coffee, what your favorite beverage is, kick back. We'll be starting in about 7 minutes. All right, friends, it is 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get this started. Banned Books in the Metaverse Liberation Library mashup today. Kind of doing a repeat of the conversation we had last week because of our technical difficulties. Our Metaverse house is under construction, so no avatars talking, just real humans, real fresh-faced humans in the flesh. So let's go ahead and get started with our breathing exercise, like we always start these experiences. So sit as you're able with your feet firmly planted on the ground. Imagine that the balls of your feet are rooted in the earth, connected to the other people listening, and the other people across realms, time and space in which we're connected through the stories that we're going to hear today. Relax your shoulders and swallow a couple of times. We'll breathe in by our nose and out of our mouths, always using our throats for this breathing exercise. Breathe in as long as possible, breathe in as slowly as possible, and breathe in as deeply as possible. Let's breathe together. Inhale, breathing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold it. And exhale. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Release. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Full expansive lungs. And exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Release. The deepest breath of the day. We're taking it together as one collective. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold it. And exhale. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Release. Open up your eyes. Come back to center. Keto dreaming. Dr. Dre, we are almost there. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I actually think we checked it on the LinkedIn. I think we can also hear it there too.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
All right, look at us today. Look at us today. How you doing? I'm gonna check real quick. I think I heard. I think I did a quick test.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not taking nothing for granted these days.
Yes.
Hear you, and I actually. Oh my gosh, we can hear each other. Awesome.
Okay, so I'm doing great and well, definitely doing better than earlier this week. And then one thing I noticed in breath, and I may have talked about this before, is that I know you go up to 6 when you, and I could go all the way. Before I couldn't like go to 6 and then hold it and then release the 6. Like I would have to like, I think I would go up to 4 or 5, but now I'm at the point where I feel like I can go the full 6. Which
Amazing.
is cool. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful testament that as we put focused attention on our breath,
Yeah.
the capacity to breathe changes, right?
Yes.
And our bodies, we're reminded that our bodies can expand with just that intention and that practice. That is amazing.
Yeah.
I know that you are coming up to the end of your beautiful dissertation. Is it done yet? And can you tell our listeners and our watchers what your dissertation is about? Because I think it's always important to add voice to stories that really don't get a lot of attention in the dominant discourse.
Oh, yeah. So my dissertation is not done. Like I'm doing edits right now. I am gonna try to submit everything by May 1st. I'm going through some revisions right now. It's going really well. And so my dissertation, everybody, is about how it's called Balik Bayan, the possibility of return through imagination. And basically, it is storying how queer Filipinx youth use different forms of imagination to make sense of their identities and also find a way to return back home to themselves. And so I basically analyze the different usages of imagination. And I think we talked about this a lot here in our Banned Books in the Metaverse around how a lot of literature talks about imagination as just future and just like thinking about it as like this big high in the sky thing. But imagination is actually, if we think about it through non-Western ways of thinking about time, it's about transcending time, past, present, future. And so I rework the definition of imagination and use the youth's ways to define it.
I think that is so important that we're talking about imagination, because that is the reason why we have these conversations in the metaverse. Because as my own awareness has been developed and honed, I'm really sensitive to how space either gives your imagination permission to run wild or can limit it. And we designed these conversations to have in a space that doesn't have to obey the same laws and physics of oppression that exists in the real world. So today, our metaverse house is under construction. So I know, right? We're gonna do our best to have expansive imagination and push the boundaries and use our bodies as best as we can to make the space as expansive with new ideas as possible, so that inspiration can come through and inspire the people who are listening. How's that sound, Dre?
That sounds great.
All right. So
seeing you, I haven't seen you in a while.
So. Right? I was like, you've seen my avatar, but I was like, I haven't seen you. I was like, oh, you look good.
Thank you. You look great too.
I'm trying.
I do this every now and then, just like
I was like, dude, I haven't seen you in a minute. Yeah. But I was like, I feel like I talk to you all the time, and I check with you. Glasses are a great look, by the way.
Thank you. Gotta put them on.
All right. So let's start with the 1619 Project. I know last time you read something, you had those words come through your body, the ones that were most resonant. I want to start there, and then I want to share some words from the Combahee River Collective, and then we'll see where the conversation goes, where we see intersections, how the words made us feel as we read them. And I think that will be enough to figure out where we go next.
Right. Okay. So last time we read the piece by Nicole Hannah-Jones where she talks about her father and the American flag. And actually, I'm going to pull up a different text, because the one that is shown, or the one that I gave you, is actually you need a
login.
A login for it. So let me pull up the one that we did last week. Unless you want to start first.
Oh, sure. I mean, I can start first. So first, I will say the Combahee River Collective is, I wouldn't say it's a widely known text. And it's probably a shame that it's not a widely known text, but I understand when I think about the identities and the bodies that created it, why it was created, why we don't know a lot about it. And I'll tell you how I stumbled upon it, listening to a conversation that Bell Hooks was having with Gloria Steinem. I think it was taped in the New School a few years ago, but I was watching it in the past 3 years, maybe during the pandemic. And one of the things that Bell Hooks said at the end, she was like, the young people don't know the history. And I considered myself well-read, well-known. But one of the things I will admit that I am still learning about is, as a queer Black woman, learning about the women that came before me, the stories that came before me, that legacy of resistance and liberation. And I will say broadly, like, that story is rarely included in the dominant narratives of the Black liberation struggle, right? So I think I got the even my knowledge of the Black liberation struggle, I would say most of the knowledge I got in school or even at home didn't include me and my body.
Yeah.
So it was almost as if I have to find out these stories. So when you hear Bell Hooks say, many of the young kids don't even know who Pat Parker is, I was like, old kid, I don't know who Pat Parker is. I know who Lord is. I don't know who Pat Parker is, right? And I was like, shame on me.
Right.
Like, I was like, so I went down this rabbit hole, discovered Pat Parker, discovered, I knew Audre Lorde. It's like, all right. So then stumbled upon this River Collective statement. So for our listeners, what the Combahee River Collective statement is, it's basically how Black lesbians said the current Black liberation movement and the current Black feminist movement of the late 70s, late 80s does not include us in our struggles.
Yes.
We are going to fill in the gap using what we see and how we see the world. And I think that's super beautiful because, we're always saying, like, with using the equity by design framework is like, what does it mean to design at the margins? It's like, no, they did it. Like, they were the most marginalized bodies. And how do those most marginalized bodies see the world? And how then do those bodies see how to heal the world, right? How do they see the pathway to liberation? So I dropped it in the chat, but it is my pleasure to have these words come out of my body. And Dre, I would love for you just to think about how does it feel to hear these? So
Okay.
it was written in 1977, ironically, the year I was born. Isn't that
Wow.
and some of the women that wrote it and a part of the collective are still alive. So I will start with maybe a few, definitely on the third of 13 pages. So not the first paragraph, but 1, 2, in the link that I said, in the 1, 2, third paragraph. Black feminists often talk about their feelings of craziness before becoming conscious of the concepts of sexual politics, patriarchal rule, and most importantly, feminism, the political analysis and practice that we women use to struggle against our oppression. The fact that racial politics and indeed racism are pervasive factors in our lives did not allow us and still does not allow most Black women to look more deeply into our own experiences and from that sharing and growing consciousness to build a politics that will change our lives and inevitably end our oppression. Our development must also be tied to the contemporary economic and political position of Black people. The post-World War II generation of Black youth was the first to be able to minimally partake of certain educational and employment options previously closed completely to Black people. Although our economic position is at the very bottom of the American capitalistic economy, a handful of us have been able to gain certain tools as a result of tokenism in education and employment, which potentially enable us to more effectively fight our oppression. A combined anti-racist and anti-sexist position drew us together initially. As we developed politically, we addressed ourselves to heterosexism and economic oppression under capitalism. I'll stop there. Dre.
Yeah. So I'm wondering too, like, the second to last sentence where it says, although our economic position is still at the very bottom of the American capitalistic economy, a handful of us have been able to gain certain tools as a result of tokenism in education and employment, which potentially enable us to fight more effectively, fight our oppression. And the way that I'm interpreting that or thinking about it is like, when we think about like education systems and gaining more access to like different privileges, like we gain those tools to effectively navigate those systems. And I feel like though not everybody uses it that way, like sometimes, like I know we talk about this thing where it's like sometimes people gain those privileges and those access, but does nothing with it. They just like kind of assimilate with the rest of that world. And so I'm wondering like what your thoughts were on that, and if that was related to what you were going to say.
Oh, I mean, there's so many things that come up for this particular one. I think the point in the beginning saying that the first generation to minimally take part of the opportunities, right? And when I think about my own experience, my parents were the first in their family, and even the first in my family to take minimally part. They still attended segregated schools. So if I think about the lineage of my family, I'm the first generation to not have to experience the apartheid that my entire family experienced for generations. Like that's deep. Right. So then the second part comes to mind is like, well, what do you do when you get access to the opportunity? Do you use it to create more comfort for yourself, or do you use it to grow and develop your own consciousness so that you can work to dismantle and free others with you? Right. And I think that is a big question, right? Because I think, we don't, we especially in the education, it's like, well, what's the whole point of going to college and acquiring all these things? It's like, I forget who said it, but oh yeah, was it? It was a beautiful writer. Oh, Toni Morrison, like you get free so you can free others.
I was literally looking for that quotation right now. I was like,
you get free so you can free others, not you get free so you can be, comfortable, maybe, like, so I think like there needs to be a reset on, the purpose of all of what we what we communicate to young people about why you need to do this, why you need to do that. Um, because like yeah, your freedom, absolutely, but then you got to go back.
Right.
You got to create spaces for others to be free. So I think those are the two things that are really, really coming up for me.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm
that
gonna say
yeah,
that
that are like core to the politic, right?
I was gonna say that I think one of the things that I've personally experienced, I think I've experienced in my world as well, and particularly in education too, is like there are elements of, and I'm glad you brought up that Toni Morrison quote because I kept thinking about like the further up you go, unfortunately, based on capitalism, like you have to turn around and bring people with you, like to make this collective movement. But like there have been a lot of gatekeeping.
Mm.
I have experienced a lot of gatekeeping in academia and all this other stuff, like whose knowledge is valuable and whose knowledge matters, and like how you bring it to the forefront, which is why like I hope that I continue in my work with queer youth of color, is that I center the voices of the queer youth, and because I feel like their knowledge and expertise that they bring to the table is worth and should be put forward, but some people don't believe that. And so
Mm.
it's interesting because like I look at that and it's like there are certain parts of American society, in our education system, in the government, and all these other places where there are parts where they're meant to gatekeep, and so
Mm.
certain people can get through this pass, and you have to have this, this, and this. But it's coming to the realization that, particularly for I think people of color and anybody who identifies or not identifies, but anyone who is marginalized, like they're gonna gatekeep you no matter what. Like,
Well, yeah. So I think it's. I mean, I think that's a. We're going to get to the gatekeep. Yes, yes. And but I think and that's why it is a larger question. So what do you do once you have the means to protect your body?
right,
What do you do when you have the means to keep your body healthy? And is it enough that you can do it? Or then well I'm sometimes I know we're going to get to like the why stories like this are so important to tell, but imagine like if I don't know if I ever had a teacher that said no, you get free so then you come back and get others, right? You
mm-hmm.
this is what you need to do. I believe my parents got that message
right,
because that's the way they moved in the world,
right, right,
right?
right,
It's like we're going home this weekend to celebrate my dad's 80th birthday, and I will tell you that the man had a whole life in the second. And like I was like, oh, you did a whole nother career dedicated to the health of Black men and high risk men living with cancer. That wasn't what your professional job was. That became your mission. Like you
mm-hmm.
survived this. Now let's go back and make. He's like, now my job is to make sure other men don't die from this.
Right,
And I'm going to go to them. I'm going to go to the women that love them, the men that love them. I'm going to go to all of them to make sure that more people don't suffer. And I'm like, how what a part of your education journey developed your consciousness so that was the reason that you did it? Because he could have been like, I'm just going to chill at home and relax
mm-hmm.
all day, and everyone would have been like, that's great, you did it.
Right, right, right.
I sometimes I think about my days of a principal, like why tell a child to work hard?
Right,
Like what is the right thing to say that keeps someone working even when it's hard?
right, right,
And how that message is like, you get free so you can free others.
mm-hmm.
Because you can't free others unless you're free.
Right, right.
And so I mean, those are the things that are coming back to mind. Talk about the gatekeeping.
Yeah, it's oh, I laugh at it because it's like, when we're talking about, and I've experienced people who, first of all, there are people in academia who will recognize you, acknowledge you, see that your work is great, and like try to uplift you along with them. And I had a couple of experiences of that where some professors or some other of my colleagues will uplift your work and share like your brilliance and like all the so that other people can hear it. But there are other situations where if like they've made it on a social media platform or just their career where they will not engage with you unless you have something else to offer. Like this idea around like, well, if you have nothing to offer me, I'm not gonna uplift you or your work, which I think is really interesting because like everyone starts somewhere in that process. But when we talk about like gatekeeping, and I'm speaking specifically on my experience, is that there have been spaces where the same 3 or 4 people are being uplifted and they're their own little like I don't want to call it a clique, but let's call it a clique. And they only uplift each other, but they're not raising the next or not turning around to like help other people and uplift their work for the community, which I think is really interesting. And I think I see this a lot in academia, which actually is really disheartening when like, trying to put your work out there, like do the work and do the thing. But I think it's important that, and I promised myself this, like as people help me cross this finish line next month, I make sure that I do the same for the people who are behind me in the same step, like, help them out and not gatekeep the knowledge I know on how to survive the system, etc. The program. So that's just my tidbit on that.
Sounds like there's a lot of discomfort in there.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of discomfort. It's very uncomfortable. It's a lot of uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's there. It's real, and I know I'm not the only person going through it. But it just reminds me of like, this is a terminal degree, and supposedly, like, you use this for good, like,
right.
And not everybody does. So.
Well, I want to say like let's be. We don't want to judge them.
Oh, for sure.
But it's perhaps like they have more work to do, and we hope that their awareness develops.
Right.
Because we also, I mean, I haven't. There have been moments where I haven't been my best self when I'm under a lot of stress.
Oh yes, for sure. 100%.
Yeah. I think life is long, and let's hope that people get better.
Right.
Dre, I would love for you to read the most powerful passages from the 1619 project that resonated with you the most.
Yes. So last week, the one that T2 Accelerator put, hopefully people can see it on the link over there. That's the one that actually works. And it takes you to a 2-page passage from The Idea of America by Nicole Hannah Jones. Now, we read this like briefly last week. You don't want me to read the whole thing, right? It's 2 pages.
I mean, whatever you feel moved to do right now.
Okay, great. So what I'll do is I'll read it. I think it's a beautiful passage. I use this passage to teach, to start off a lot of my humanities classes when I had come into it. And it just makes you think a little bit more about critique and also thinking about like the ways and things that are put out there for us to learn about our history. So I'll start reading that here. So this is an excerpt from The Idea of America by Nicole Hannah Jones. I'll start off with this first section. So it says, my dad always flew an American flag in our front yard, and the blue paint on our 2-story house was perennially chipping. The fence or the rail by the stairs or the front door existed in a perpetual state of disrepair. But that flag always flew pristine. Our corner lot, which had been redlined by the federal government, was along the river that divided the black side from the white side of our Iowa town. At the edge of our lawn, high on an aluminum pole, soared the flag, which my dad would replace as soon as it showed the slightest tatter. So when I was young, that flag outside our home never made sense to me. How could this Black man, having seen firsthand the way the country abused Black Americans, how it refused to treat us as full citizens, proudly fly its banner? I didn't understand his patriotism, and it deeply embarrassed me. I had been taught in school through cultural osmosis that the flag wasn't really ours, that our history as a people began with enslavement, and that we had contributed little to this great nation. It seemed that the closest thing Black Americans could have to cultural pride was to be found in our vague connection to Africa, a place we had never been. That my dad felt so much honor in being an American felt like a marker of his degradation, his acceptance of our subordination. Like most young people, I thought I understood so much when in fact I understood so little. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he raised that flag. He knew that our people's contributions to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible, and that the United States simply would not exist without us. In August 1619, just 12 years after the English settled Jamestown, Virginia, 1 year before the Puritans landed at Plymouth Rock, and some 157 years before the English colonists even decided they wanted to form their own country, the Jamestown colonists brought 20 to 30 enslaved Africans from English pirates. The pirates had stolen them from a Portuguese slave ship that had forcibly taken them from what is now the country of Angola. Those men and women who came ashore on that August day were the beginning of American slavery. They were among the 12.5 million Africans who would be kidnapped from their homes and brought in chains across the Atlantic Ocean in the largest forced migration in human history until the Second World War. Almost 2 million did not survive the grueling journey known as the Middle Passage. Before the abolishment of the international slave trade, 400,000 enslaved Africans would be sold into America, and those individuals and their descendants transformed the lands to which they'd been brought into some of the most successful colonies in the British Empire. Through backbreaking labor, they cleared the land across the southeast. They taught the colonists to grow rice. They grew and picked the cotton that at the height of slavery was the nation's most valuable commodity, accounting for half of all American exports and 66% of the world's supply. They built the plantations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, sprawling properties that today attract thousands of visitors from across the globe, captivated by the history of the world's greatest democracy. They laid the foundations of the White House and the Capitol, even placing with their unfree hands the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol dome. They lugged the heavy wooden tracks of the railroads that crisscrossed the South and that helped take the cotton they picked to the northern textile mills, fueling the Industrial Revolution. They built vast fortunes for white people north and south. At one time, the second richest man in the nation was a Rhode Island slave trader. Profits from Black people's stolen labor helped the young nation pay off its war debts and finance some of our most prestigious universities. It was the relentless buying, selling, insuring, and financing of their bodies and the products of their labor that made Wall Street a thriving banking, insurance, and trading sector, and New York City the financial capital of the world. It would be historically inaccurate to reduce the contributions of Black people to the vast material wealth created by our bondage. Black Americans have also been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other of the groups in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie, and our Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with a certain inalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of Black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully one-fifth of the country. Yet, despite being violently denied in the freedom and justice promised to all, Black Americans believed fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of Black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its founding ideals. And not only for ourselves, Black rights struggles paved the way for every other rights struggles, including women's and gays' rights, immigrant and disability rights. Without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. My father knew that what it would take me years to understand, that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as 1776, that Black Americans, as much as those men cast in alabaster in the nation's capital, are this nation's true founding fathers, and that no people has a greater claim to that flag than us.
Why do you think people have such an issue with that,
I
Dre?
listen. It's because it's like I don't want to call it counter story, but like it's the story that was not really told to us. Like, I remember reading that for the first time and thinking about how powerful that passage was, and that people like our youth need to read it, like especially middle school. Like everybody needs to read it, but like so, it just provided a different. Sorry, I think
my mic's not on.
No, it's making noise, like it's like wind or.
Oh yeah. That's music. I'll turn it off. There you go.
So yeah, what are your thoughts on when you hear that, because I've read that like now like 5 or 6 times, and every time I read it, I get this like reaction of like, wow, like a lot of the stuff that I learned when I was a kid in history, even in high school, is not even equivalent or close to like what she was trying to make a statement in that opening section.
Yeah. One, it was beautifully written.
Yeah.
One. Two, I think that I think about how fractured our society is right now. And a part of that fracture is that all the stories aren't there. I think really what you were reading is like the stories that I got growing up at home in my family, and then the stories I got in school, because I was born and raised in Hampton, Virginia, where where the first two Africans were dropped off. Right, I know where their descendants are. Right, there is a graveyard literally in Hampton in the Black neighborhood where the descendants of the first Africans are buried, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was never taught in the school. That was like, my dad would be like, you see that family over there, they're the first descendants.
Right.
And like we would talk amongst ourselves about who those people were, what their last names were. I won't say their surnames now, but it's like they had very prominent surname that everybody, like if you knew one, like one, we went to school with them. Like we were like, oh, you're so and so, and they knew who they were. We know who they were. So it was like there was a part of the story that we knew that no one else knew.
Right.
Right. And I asked my dad, because I went to did my graduate work at Harvard, and that was the first time that I had spent a significant time in Boston, Cambridge area. Most of my education had been in Virginia, right? And I was like, it is so interesting to me about who owns the narrative about where the country started.
Mm.
Boston runs that narrative, right? It really runs that narrative, and I'm just like, yo, this joker started here.
Right.
Like I can show, Shirley Plantation down, in King and Queen County, like Charles County in Virginia, like we know where it also started, right? So, and I said, Dad, why? I was like, why hasn't like the South and Virginia in particular owned the narrative? He was like, it's shame. Slavery. He said, because if Virginia owns the narrative, then you also have to take a part of that narrative. You have to take slavery, you have to take Jim Crow, you have to take massive resistance, and all of the uncomfortable stuff comes with the story.
Mm.
But it gets back to what we said earlier, is like there's this part about what do you do when you get free, right? Yeah. And it's like there is a responsibility to free others, and that freeing of others could simply be telling the story.
Yep.
Telling the story to say, no, we're here. Not we're here and you're not here, but we're here too.
Right. That's why I liked that I wouldn't call it a reframe, but I liked how this idea of America short excerpt discussed that term, like founders of America. Like,
yeah.
Who are the founding fathers? Who are the founding people? Because obviously we're taught the founding fathers are the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, or the people white men. And so to get that other part of the story and expand the definition of who the founding people were, I thought was really important. And I think as an educator, having that conversation with students was really necessary.
What did they say? What did the students say?
They were just as I feel like, especially when I taught this in Chicago, it was there is a shock factor to it, because they had been taught for years who the founding fathers were. They could say them by name, like George Washington, and
right.
And so we had some really great conversation around, do you hear that?
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
We had some really great conversation about like, um, and the one year that I did teach social studies, we like kind of come up with these questions about like when we read different or when we learn about different periods of American history, we always ask ourselves the questions: who is missing? Why are they missing? How can we figure out what those things are? Because that was like what we came up with when we finished that excerpt. Was like,
Mhm.
oh wow! And I remember even it was a beautiful thing we had. There was a question on this passage that comes along with it where it was like, what is the main thesis of the paragraph? And everybody, one student brought up the thesis around how Black Americans and Black history is part of the founding of our country, part of the founding people of our country. And it was just like a beautiful way to like, as we continued learning history that year, always asking the question, what is missing in this story and how
Mhm.
the story is being framed. So
Yeah.
I love it as an opener. I love it as an opener to the year because it's like the reframing of how you're going to look at history.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to the Combahee River Collective, right? Because again, this is another founding statement. So it's broken up into the second section is what we believe. So I'm reading the first two paragraphs of what we believe. And as I'm reading, I would love folks just to sit with the words, how they make you feel, and especially what Tito Dreaming Dre just said. It's like, how does this resolve the conflict of who's missing? What we believe. Above all else, our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, may because our need as human persons for autonomy. This may seem so obvious as to sound simplistic, but it is apparent that no other ostensibly progressive movement has ever considered our specific oppression as a priority or worked seriously for the ending of that oppression. Merely naming the pejorative stereotypes attributed to Black women, e.g., mammy, matriarch, sapphire, whore, bull dagger, let alone cataloging the cruel, often murderous treatment we receive, indicates how little value has been placed upon our lives during the 4 centuries of bondage in the Western Hemisphere. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity. I will read that again. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression. In the case of Black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that we have preceded us that anyone is more worthy of liberation than ourselves. We reject pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough.
Firstly, like, where are you? Because I was like looking at the text. Um, the collectivism piece around it, the theme around collectivism is extremely important. And I, when you reread the sentence, like I had to stop and think too, where it's like we believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression.
Ooh,
And it's just like thinking about like, yeah, like, thinking about the way, especially the way that they were writing this, like for themselves, like, um, we care about us. Like, and you talk about this a lot too, with me before, is that you do have to care for yourself. Um, first before you can like go around and like help other people and bring other people with you. And so to close it with that last sentence, to be recognized as human, levelly human is enough. It's just, yeah.
I mean, it's so simple,
Yeah.
but I mean, it makes me think about. And I know there's a lot of like anti-DEI. I mean, I saw something that said DEI must die, and I'm like, really?
Right.
But it's like the sentence that I would keep saying. It's like, no, like the most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, and why, and so that idea is resonant. And then I practice a lot of yoga, and one of the things my teacher said, the only responsibility you have is to know yourself,
Mm.
because once you know yourself, you know everything else, because you process the world through yourself.
Right.
And I mean, like, that's quite like puzzling and esoteric, but it's like, no, like I have to know my own struggles. I
Right.
have to know like what makes me uncomfortable. I have to know it's not about like I can save the trees, but I have to like I save the trees by saving myself. Right?
Right.
And so let's this gets us to the conversation about schools and everything, but like if I'm reflective about my own education experience, it was more focused on other people's stories than my own. What would happen, and what would a classroom look like if it was focused on the student, like specifically not the student learning just other people's stories? Because I think that, I mean, like, there's a place for that, but making sense of their own story.
Mm.
What do you think, Dre? Talk to me.
Yeah, especially I think too, thinking about like being a teacher and seeing like what stories are centered, particularly both in English language arts and um, history and the
Mhm.
humanities, like what stories are being centered. Things would be different if the things were centered on the particular student. Now, I also often think about like what happens when you have a class that is diverse in student background and etc. But I also think that is the place for exploration and the place for like we've been doing this in Man Books in the Metaverse. We've been talking about coming of age.
Yeah.
I think for the last year, we've been
Mhm.
talking about coming of age. And coming of age is a universal experience. It's not just regulated to one demographic or one group. We've realized through multiple stories that we've read over the course of this year that coming of age could show up in many different ways. And why not, instead of using the same Catcher in the Rye story or Gatsby or whatever, why not use Baldwin's story or use Jose Antonio Vargas's story? What's the book that we read with you that was we only read the first paragraph of each
Oh,
thing?
Zami.
Zami, that we only read the first paragraph, y'all, and we got coming of age from the beginning to the end.
Right.
It's like there's so many ways and so many stories to tell. I think exploration and like using different types of text would just be amazing.
Mm, 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 mm. So before we start doing the dreaming about creating a public school experience that could heal the fracture and include the stories, let's hear one more passage from the 1619 Project. Do you have one?
Yeah. So in the chat, I put the full issue in
Mhm.
there, and I just want to put that in there because that is the PDF version to the a full magazine version of it. And if you want to put that in the chat,
Sure. I'm gonna do it. I think I did already.
that one is you just put the Nicole Hannah Jones Idea of America.
All right. So what's the other one that?
I just sent it to you in the private chat. You'll see there's a second link in there that says issue of the 1619 Project.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. All right, friends, let's go in the chat. There we go.
Okay, so in the chat, when you click on that, that gives you the full issue, and you can actually go through it. It's 100 pages, and you can go through the different things that the different topics that come up. So like in there, you'll see that they talk about, there's one on when you understand the brutality of American capitalism, you have to start at the plantation. They talk about universal health care. They talk about how traffic jams in Atlanta, you might seem they have nothing to do with slavery, but they do. And so like there's like a lot of different things in there. And then I also encourage everyone to get the book, because the book is really great. And then also there's a podcast that Nicola Hannah Jones did with her students at Howard University, where they kind of like reframed it. So if you go ahead and click on that and turn to page, I think it's 29. I'm just going to do a poem because we only have 5 minutes. So the poem, page 29, it is written by Yusef Komunyakaa. And it is on the top, you'll see that it says March 5th, 1770, Crispus Attucks, a fugitive from slavery who works as a dock worker, becomes the first American to die for the cause of independence after being shot in a clash with British troops. Which, by the way, when we teach this in U.S. history, when you look at textbooks, like this is like a sentence.
Oh, I know.
At one sentence. And then it becomes like one question on the test where you just match him.
Oh, yeah, multiple choice. Was it Washington? Was it Martin Luther King? Was it Crispus Attucks? Was it Benjamin?
Yes. And so it's just like pretty interesting. So here is the poem. It says, African and Natick bloodborn, known along paths up and down, Boston Harbor escaped slave. Harpooner and rope maker, he never dreamt a pursuit of happiness or destiny, yet rallied beside patriots who hurled a fury of snowballs, craggy dirt frozen chunks of ice and oyster shells. At the stout flank of redcoats, as the 29th Regiment of Foot aimed muskets, waiting for fire. How often had he walked, gazing down at gray timbers of the wharf as if it were to find a lost copper coin. Wine devil cold air as he stood, leaning on the hardwood stick, and then 2 lead bullets tore his chest, blood reddening snow on King Street, March 5th, 1770, first to fall on captain's command. 5 colonists lay for calling hours in Faneuil Hall before sharing a grave at the granary burying ground. They laid a foundering stone for the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, first to defy and die. And an echo of the future rose over the courtroom as John Adams defended the Brits, calling the dead. A, quote, motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish jactars, who made soldiers fear for their lives, and at the day's end only 2 would pay with the branding of their thumbs. I think, and one of the things I as like I'm rereading this now, was one of the things the student said when we read this particular piece is like how much more context you get on a particular person, because we just talked about like when we did read this initially, because I had put this as a separate text to the 1 sentence liner, and I didn't tell them that there was a 1 sentence liner, but like the stark difference of like, the poem is just like giving a little bit more context. I think a lot of the students talked about like, well, like if we just read the textbook on its own, you get one liner that, oh, he died. Yeah. Versus like getting the full context of a human being. And even though it's like a poem and it was written differently, like it still offers the humanity aspect of it as well.
Yeah, it's we reject pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 spaces behind to be recognized as human. Levelly human is enough. Right? So, all right, Dre, let's get to dream world. What does a school look like when it recognizes the children as human, levelly human, and that they are enough? Go.
Ooh, I think one of the things to recognize in order for what you just said, recognize as human, levelly human is enough, you have to start with the cultural practices that are happening in the school.
All right, talk to us. What do you think?
there's just so much to talk about. When you talk about cultures of the way schools, I think one, you have to look at quote unquote disciplinary measures, like the way
Right.
that they quote unquote discipline, because I think, you know, I think about schools often around like, the punitary stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and the suspensions and the expulsions, and not recognizing that children are humans who are learning and
Mm.
learning to grow, and they're going to make mistakes,
Mm.
and how sometimes like the mistakes that they make are such a costly measure. um, like you're about to lose an entire education system because you made one mistake and no one told you, no one taught you, and like that's the only way they're going to teach you, I think, is one thing. I also think about when we like in terms of like classroom dynamics, and this is something that I look forward to doing more post dissertation around how we flatten the hierarchy in the classroom around experts, and who
Mhm.
is the expert. Like youth and students have the capabilities to be that, and to
Right.
lead the discussions, and to lead the exploration, and to really set the scenes in the classroom and what learning can look like, instead of it being like the teacher is just the only expert in the room and we're just like capping knowledge on them and that's it.
Yeah.
But I think it all starts with culture.
Yeah, and the insight that I'm about to share, I think it's always been there, but it's been more crystallized in the past few days. I've been thinking a lot about, the framework that we teach, equity by design, and I was like, no, no, no. I think I know it's the right framework. I was like, I don't know if I'm being as specific enough, right? And as we've had the chance to go into more in classrooms, around the country and work with leaders and do walkthroughs, it has been crystal clear to me now in a way that it hasn't been um, before. Is no, designing at the margins is a way to recognize the humanity of those who've been left behind, right? Those who've been marginalized. And it's like, so then what does that look like in the classroom? And it's so obvious, Dre, and we're overlooking it. It's we don't aggregate data, we disaggregate it, and we look at the success of the most marginalized as success, right? It is, how is the child who's experiencing home, housing insecurity, who just got here, who doesn't speak English, may identify as a sexual minority, is a student of color, like how does that child move through the school? How do they hear their story? Do they feel seen? And if they don't feel seen, that's not their fault, that's our fault.
Mm,
That's not their fault, right? That is, if they don't feel seen, if they're not succeeding, if they're not thriving, that means the adults in the building are not seeing them as human.
mm-hmm.
Might see them as pets, or they're cute, but it's like, do you see them as human? And I'm going to be real bold and vulnerable and say, like, I wasn't always that teacher.
Right. Right.
I wasn't always that principal,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, no, but it's like, this is, what do we do now? It's like, no, no, no. All we have to do is move our attention. Just like move your attention. Like the child, that's who you focus on. And then it's like, how do we then build the capacity to focus on one child or two or three children that
Right.
make you very uncomfortable without losing sight of the other 20 in the room?
Right.
Without making them feel excluded. That is personal work.
Right. Right.
And I will go so far as to say, and then not have your ego stroked or inflated because the kids who are already doing well continue to do well. Because it's easy to say, like, oh, I feel really good because you answered my question. You didn't, but I'm gonna, like, but you're feeding me. Like, you're making me feel good about myself. You're making me feel good about my practice. But that child isn't making me feel good, or that family is not making me feel effective. So I'm not going to pay attention to them.
Mm.
So, it gets back to this question in the Combahee River Collective. It's not even a question. It's like, we have to start with ourselves. Our identities alone is the tool and the pathway to our own liberation. So I know it's like it seems like it's the simplest things are often the hardest to do.
Right.
Simplest things are often the hardest to do. So I think that's what's coming up for me in terms of how do we start to see the people who make us most uncomfortable, who threaten the mythologies of ourselves. How do we see them as human? Because the myths that we carry will disregard their humanity, and that's why they're myths.
Right. Right. It's back to the, your framework too around like starting with yourself and really paying attention to like your feelings and how you feel. And because like those are things that come up in the classroom, comes up in our schools.
Absolutely.
And I guess the question would be like, how does that work? Because I think it's easy to say for, there are people out there who are self-starters who are going to do that. But how does that become a more, I don't want to call it streamlined, but a way, like a practice that is embedded in teaching?
Yeah. You know what? I think that we have to make some honest acknowledgments on the way we as educators are trained and the way we're developed. I was in a conversation with someone and he was like, oh yeah, the PD system is broken. The PD system is broken. I was like, bruh, no, it's not. It just wasn't designed for social change. Right. It just wasn't designed to include everybody.
Right.
Right. I was like, that's not broken. It was just, it's not, I was like, we have it has a different need. Like we're asking it to do something it wasn't designed to do.
Right.
Once we start talking about acknowledging the humanity of everyone in the classroom, then it's like, oh, then what has to be true to do that? How then do we develop the adults? And I think that's where we're just like, no, the identity work, well, whether we call it DEI or whatever we're going to call it, it was called something else 30 or 40 years ago. No, it's required. If you want to recognize the humanity of every human in the building, right, including humans of European descent, right? It's required, but their humanity is often recognized and validated at the expense of other humanities, right? So I think that we have to acknowledge that our system needs to do different things now. If we want to heal the fracture, if we want to work as a collective, and then we start working backwards and say, like, what does an educator in a classroom need to know and be able to do that? And then it becomes another layer, Dre. It's like, then we recognize the demographics of our public school. 80% of the teaching force are white women. More than 50% of the students are students of color. Then It's like, what has to be true? Like, let's use that as a persona so that population and those adjacent, like folks who have access to power, money, resources, either by tokenism or whatever, that can see the humanity of those who don't have. And that's the way we design the professional learning, right? That's a very different professional learning system.
Right.
So that's what I think.
Yeah.
We start with by design. We start with ourselves. We design it. But yeah, I mean, like, again, I think we can get there. And I think a part of our job now that we're just a little bit more free than we were 5 years ago.
Yeah. I was going to say, and this is like a new learning for me. Like initially I thought when you had, I met T2 Accelerator like 5 years ago. So when I first was introduced to the framework, I thought it was linear. And then I realized it's not linear.
Hey, say more about that. That's the last word. Because we come up with
it's not linear, because I thought it was like, oh, you start with yourself and then you do this and then you speak with the future and design the future and then you do this. And it's only been actually maybe the last year and a half where I was like, oh no, it's cyclical. Like, it's like you're constantly in it. Like, it's like there's no, and I think that's what people want, is because we're so used to linear.
Oh.
That we want like this and then this and then this, but actually this work is like, we're going to be going in circles on the same thing. And sometimes you're going to go backwards and sometimes you're going to move forwards and sometimes you're going to go backwards, but it's all about the movement and that you're still in it cyclically, which is important, which goes back to, the way that we even look at time. So
the way we look at time. And I think that's why we have to continue to reinforce that equity is a verb. It's a practice. teaching is a verb, it's a practice.
Right.
And our job as educators, whether we are in the formal system or the third space system, is to keep people engaged in their practice of growth and learning. So we are at 12 o'clock. I think we did it, Dre. I think we have a new format.
Yeah, we do. This is an amazing format. I hope other people come and join. Like,
I know, right? But yeah, so we're going to try this again as we get our Metaverse houses under construction. Thank y'all so much for joining Banned Books in the Metaverse. I like this mashup too with 1619 Project and Combahee River Collective. Let's finish it up next week with the same stuff because this feels good.
Yes.
All right. Happy writing, Dre. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for watching, y'all.
Before you take a pic.
Oh yeah, do a screenshot.
Yeah, screenshot. Hold on. Where's my 3? Okay, here we go. You want to do it or I'll do it?
I just did it.
Oh, do another one.
All right, friend. Take care. Happy writing.